So let's go ahead and do our introduction. Welcome everyone to another episode of Notes from the Aleph. An Aleph is a high point from which all things are visible, and from our vantage point, we'll be looking at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those designs. Around here, our motto is to be fair, build up, and have fun. Around here, I'm your host, GriffinVarro, joined by our editor, Theta, our local designer, Norman Rafferty, our good friend and GM, RedRabbit, and of course, our special guest today, Piat. When it comes to tabletop games, I have 15 years of experience running, playing, and frequently fixing problematic rule sets at the table. Pronouns are he, him, and they, them. Let's go ahead and go. Rafferty, why don't you go next?
Hello, world. I'm Norman Rafferty, he, him. I work for sanguinegames.com, where since 1999, we have made tabletop role-playing games. I also, before that, did some goofy stuff for stuff like Shadis and Steve Jackson Games, some other weird stuff, but mostly it's Sanguine Games. And I've also worked with this person. So I guess.
All right, so this person, Piat, why don't you go?
Hello, I'm Piat. I've been playing tabletop role-playing games in one form or another since 1987, and I've been writing them since 1999, thanks in large part to Norman Rafferty. Most of the stuff I've done has been for Sanguine. I've also done a bit of writing for 3N Games and for a publisher that went under before the games were published. That's me. I've written some Cthulhu Cup adventures for a sponsored Call of Cthulhu tournament at HammerCon, which is a local game convention that ran for a few years.
Did you run those too, or did you just write those?
I wrote them, and also I judged and ran some other ones for the years I didn't write it.
Very nice. And Red.
Hi, I am RedRabbit, a professional GM, currently running the Ironclaw game on our Raktus channel here. And I'm currently also running games of 5th edition and Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition and Dungeon World, and I consider myself to be a student of narrative and game design.
All right. Then let's go ahead and get into today's topic. So, when it comes to horror today, Cthulhu and all of his likenesses have maintained a very special place in the pop culture imagination. Cthulhu continues to kind of work his particular brand of horror well in books, shows, and movies, where audiences can simply watch the characters descend into madness, but things get more complicated once we try to fit it into modern gaming. The juxtaposition between the power fantasy of modern games and the universal helplessness to forces and monsters outside of our control can create a little bit of conflict in design, just a tiny bit. So here today, we've invited Piat, who's worked on the Nightlands RPGs and Call of Cthulhu Tournament Adventures, to talk about how to handle Cthulhu and other horrors in role-playing games.
Yes, and I'm glad to be here. It's actually an interesting question and not an easy one to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the Cthulhu mythos has kind of seeped into the collective unconsciousness, especially kind of nerd unconsciousness or counterculture unconsciousness for a long time. And I think that every kind of generation thinks that, oh yeah, we've discovered this new Lovecraft thing, kind of thing, and they think it's pretty cool for a while. They're like, hey, wait a minute, he was kind of problematic. They discover that as well. Or, he was kind of wordy, he was kind of boring, and then they get over it. But in many ways, I don't think we actually are engaging with it, and it becomes very difficult to engage with what the mythos is about, as you mentioned, in a gaming narrative format. A lot of current Lovecraft media, especially in game format, focuses on really superficial elements, still essential elements, but in the sense they're not unique to Lovecraft. You get the body horror, the tentacles, unpronounceable names, miscegenation with monsters, and other contexts, sort of thing. It focuses on the lurid and the violent and the idea of a struggle against the lurid and violent, terrible monsters and things from outside our experience, and on the sex. And, sometimes sublimated or implied shows up more clearly in media other than game media. Mm-hmm. And that was definitely part of the pulps overall. But that's certainly not unique to Lovecraft, because if you look at the John Carter books, like John Carter of Mars, Edgar Rice Burroughs, that is just chock full of naked Edwardians in leather posing harnesses, wading hip deep in the blood of uncivilized, monster aliens and vampire trees, and also having sex with Martian women with cloacas.
Yeah, if I can interject here, like, you may not have read John Carter of Mars, but you've seen those Boris Vallejo pictures. There was the purple background and the orange bronze muscled people, and so to
Mhm.
say that the Boris Vallejo stuff comes from the same stuff as the Cthulhu stuff, it's like, gotta start thinking a little bit here.
Right.
But,
And we can
go
see
ahead.
this like in a lot of horror where like maybe the metaphor drops off for simply the spectacle of it. And spectacle is definitely something people like a lot.
Well, because there's a question I want to ask Piat, because I keep forgetting this. Piat, where is the monument to the limitless resources of the Earth?
That's in Chicago, and it's actually a 1/3 or 1/2 scale replica of the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Yeah.
And on the base of it, it's actually a water tower, and on the base of it, it's talking about how it's from late 20s or early 30s,
Right.
in that this is a monument to man's ingenuity and our limitless power and our conquest of the natural forces in the service of
Right.
mankind. Yeah.
And the reason why I always go on that, like, I know Piat thinks that monument's hilarious, and I mean, I like it because I think that solidifies, like, as Piat just said, everyone thinks they discovered this for the first time and then reinvents it for their time. The original Cthulhu mythos comes out of that time period where the resources of the earth are something to be conquered. Mankind is the apex of evolution mandated by God to dominate everything. And so the Cthulhu stories were a reaction, or an inversion to show horror. Like, what if humans weren't the top of the food chain? What if there were other spacefaring beings which had technology and also issues and mandates, and were doing things way beyond even our understanding? And so that's where, like, Cthulhu's palace makes no sense. Astaroth is at the center of the universe, doesn't care about you, and to merely look at him and see his immensity and intelligence as unfathomable would drive you mad. Plus, also the idea that humans could be wiped out, which is the one with the great race of Yith. Is that the Dreaming of the Future story?
I don't remember the name of it. I just remember the general beats of it.
Yeah, the guy who's possessed with the great race of Yith. Which
Oh.
story is that?
I would have to look it up, I'm afraid.
Okay, sorry. Well, anyway, like, going in the future and seeing, like H.G. Wells also wrote about this, a future where humans no longer exist and the human race is extinct. These ideas were crazy, scary, even blasphemous stuff back in the 20s and 30s. The idea that God's not real, no other gods. And the problem is, like, this is extremely faded. By the time World War II in the 50s and atomic horror comes around, the idea that we could somehow kill everyone on Earth with biological warfare or atomic warfare or something is old hat. And the idea that there are forces greater than us that could totally destroy us, the space age has already, like, done that to death. And so one of the problems is when you try to take this old school 20s and 30s type eldritch horror, that stuff's not scary anymore. So a lot of people are seizing on other aspects of it. Or my argument's going to be, you can't take, in order to make that stuff kind of scary, you have to know what it is. A lot of people, I think, are being Rob Liefelds and are copying the style rather than the substance, where they're just saying, oh, look at an alien would drive you crazy, and casting spells would drive you crazy. And when you go crazy, you turn into sexual deviance. And it's like, that's not exactly, that's more comical than harm.
But I'm going to say that, as just out of that, I think Lovecraft was also expressing something that was actually quite common to a lot of people of his background, was a realization and a fear that the world was not as they wanted to be. It was not E.L. Del Toro's Ragtime, same thing. The world is changing. This is like 1910s, 1920s. And I mean, that's true for every generation. This is their own particular expression of it. And his horror is essentially like a conservative horror. You've got the elements of the fear of the other, the fear of loss of self.
Definitely, because I need to interject here. The story of the Call of Cthulhu, like, it's important. Like, the Elder Gods don't care about us. I mean, in fact, this is something we have to get into too, because in the original Cthulhu stories, the Elder Gods are indifferent to us. They would destroy the world. They don't care. But in the story of the Call of Cthulhu, there's a cult in the South that worships Cthulhu and is, like, doing mutilations and sacrifices to them, even though technically Cthulhu doesn't actually care about anyone. And this goes hand in hand with the 1980s thing that still goes on today, the Satanic Panic, which was the idea that somewhere out there's a dark cult that kidnaps people and babies and mutilates them for some purpose, perhaps they're supposed to get rewarded.
Blood libel.
Right.
QAnon, draining adrenochrome from people. Just every generation has
where half the horror of it is the horror of people, or as from a conservative viewpoint in this case.
Well, yeah, right. And in fact, I think it's funny. Okay, at least they're harvesting the adrenochrome, says Rafferty.
It's scientifically sound, yes.
Doing something. But you're right. All of this is very conservative, biased. Of our values are being challenged. Now in H.P. Lovecraft's story, everything's nihilist, everybody just dies. But it definitely comes out of that fear, and that's what makes it palpable to some of the readers who would go, "Oh, I also hate the unknown."
Yeah, whatever's unfamiliar. But I'm just going to interject and say I don't think that Lovecraft stories are necessarily that nihilist. It's just that he's looking for salvation in the past, another essentially conservative trait. And as we say, the fear that he was expressing was also because he was from this sort of background of impoverished respectability, where he is supposed to be this upper middle class New England gentleman, but in actuality, his father went crazy, his mother went crazy, his dad had died of syphilis or something. I would have to look up the specifics in here. He did not have the money to maintain what he wanted. He could not fit into the current world. He got married. He went to New York. He was terrified by all the foreigners, all the people of different races and different languages. But it kind of reminds me of George Orwell, because he similar background of this constrained middle class respectability that was falling away as the empire, the order of the world was collapsing around them, or not collapsing, but changing into something else. When he was a little boy, and up until he was a teenager, one of his worst fears was that he would have to drink from a water bottle that had been used by a working person. And that filled him with horror and revulsion.
To be fair, maybe don't drink from other people's water bottles, but
yeah, but I mean, that's the most horrible thing you can think of. And he couldn't embrace that, and it became a fetish for him. He would, he would immerse himself in poverty. He would go to the other, and he wanted to see what they lived like. It was just, whereas Lovecraft just kind of tried to seal himself up for the rest of his life, and only talk to people through letters and so forth. Very different reaction to it.
Oh yeah, because Orwell went and saw things. Orwell has war diaries, for crying out loud.
Definitely, yeah.
I'm glad you point out the nihilism, but I want to ask Red. So Red, you're coming into this after so the 90s happened, and I actually late 80s, because Vampire's 89. I'm so old, and that shows up, and that takes a very different take on horror, where you have the World of Darkness shows up and briefly eclipses D&D in popularity, where the idea that we're horrible blood-sucking monsters is cool, actually. So that's going to change the horror landscape. What's been your experience with horror in the tabletop media?
So I actually don't have a lot of experience playing horror games in this form, right? I've played a bunch of video games. I've actually never, outside of maybe the Arkham Horror board game, and the less said about that, probably the better. I don't think I've ever played, really interacted with a Cthulhu mythos medium outside of the books themselves.
Well, Arkham Horror is a pretty good representative of what people, both the classical and the modern tropes. So that's actually pretty good.
Yeah. I mean,
just horror in general, then.
But I'm talking about. But you run Vampire the Masquerade, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Well,
so in perspective, in gaming in the 70s and 80s is a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and its imitators, where anyone fail one saving throw versus death and you're killed, or you can't jump a 10-foot gorge because you're a normal person, and magical spells have to be researched and do all this weird stuff. Along comes Vampire, that takes place specifically in the modern day and makes all of you specifically monsters. But also a big deal about that is you also have the humanity trait. So what do you Do you think of Vampire as a horror game, or is it a fantasy game that just happens to have horror trappings, or what?
I think it's probably on its surface, and what attracts a lot of people to it, in my experience, is the power fantasy of it. Because as you said, you're playing as the monsters. When you are the monster in the setting, I don't think the goal is ever to be exclusively a scary game. But they have underlined many times in World of Darkness that these are games about personal horror, right? That's how they frame it. And I've tried to work with that. In my mind, personal horror is a lot more about, I mean, I think the way that Vampire frames it is it's sort of like the loss of humanity. I think that you could play a vampire game for years and never touch those themes. But in my game, we have tried to. It's something we try to unpack. But I think a lot of horror is that people enjoy today is very surface level. So I think that like when people think horror, if you take away the psychological aspect to it, what's the difference between a bloody violent horror story and a bloody violent action story? I think that people are attracted to modern day horror because of the tropes of just like sensational things happening.
Well,
I don't know if that answers your question.
These are games and people play them to have fun.
Yeah.
The particular bug I have in my butt is the difficulty gaming has in trying to quantify or put a mechanic on horror. Because you got Vampire the Masquerade had the humanity trait, which in New World of Darkness in 2003 turns into morality, which I understand that the God King update, whatever, I guess that's the Chronicles of Darkness version, has changed it a little bit.
The God Machine, I believe you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, God Machine. Right. I think Chronicle, whatever. It's the new version. And there's like Call of Cthulhu, when it was first written, was the role-playing game, was based off of RuneQuest, which for a long time was a big competitor to D&D. RuneQuest was a skill-based system and rejected level-based in terms of skill-based, but it was still freaking deadly. You still had 10 hit points, and monsters could do 46 or 56 in a single hit. It's ridiculous. But the person who was the original designer wanted there to be some sort of mechanic where to try and put dread in the game, which gave us the idea that, well, every time you see a monster, you have to pass a roll. And if you, the way you either pass or fail the roll, you'll have an attribute called sanity, which is like hit points, and it will be drained. And when your sanity drains to 0, your character is removed from play. You've gone mad and can no longer play. And even interim sanity, just like in RuneQuest, hit points, you didn't just die when your hit points reached 0. If you took a lot of hit points in one big chunk, you got a debilitating injury. Because why would games be fun? And so the same thing was true about sanity. If you took a big chunk of sanity in a big hit, you would become insane by the interpretation of someone who had vaguely heard of the American Psychological Association in the 1970s.
So, of course, comes in with the background of all of these terrible, horrible things like standard depression or sexual deviancy, and then puts those as mental illnesses.
Yeah, and I'm still seeing that showing up in modern games because people are influenced by that. And I mean, my standing argument is that's not even in the original Lovecraft stories. Like Piot said, they're not entirely as nihilistic as I said. There are some heroes in the stories who are just go, and when the lights go out, I'm going to die. Oh no, the lights went out. I'm through a burning eye.
Madness really happens to the hero, like to the narrators. Like you think of it as, oh, that's the thing where you read if you see a book, you read it, you go crazy. That doesn't happen in the stories.
Yeah. No.
If anything, you have the thing where the narrator is the sanest person in the room, and the other people think that they are crazy because they're seeing one of the universe as it is.
Right. They read a book and they have new knowledge.
Yeah, but I mean, it's all tied to, I think. Okay, so I'm going to say there is a Lovecraft's only novel, Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, or Kadath, however you like to pronounce that, has a happy ending in a way. And have you guys read that at all, or?
I don't think I've read the Dream World.
Very wordy, but yeah, do you not remember how it ends, Raph?
Yeah, I do. All right, spoilers. But by the way, everybody check out Mockman Press to the comic adaptation, which is my favorite version. But no, the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is Carter wants to go see Kadath, and then does. Man,
but then do you know what it turns out Kadath was?
well, it turns out Kadath is the sleeping dream. The gods have gone to a little Elysium that they think is so much cooler, and they're kind of dreaming there where they're not doing their duties and that kind of stuff.
And where is that place?
Well, it's Kadath, isn't it?
Kadath is Boston when Randolph Carter was a little boy.
That part, right? Yeah. It turns out the most beautiful place on earth is Randolph Carter's boyhood home. Who knew?
Yeah, so it's basically about childhood. And so the organ chords of morning's myriad whistles and dawn's blaze thrown dazzling through purple plains by the great gold dome of the State House on the hill. Randolph Carter shoutingly awake within his Boston room. Birds sang in hidden gardens, and like his cat is there, and everything's happy in it. And
I mean, it's kind of like
heaven was inside him all along. So this is what I'm talking about when it's like H.P. Lovecraft's stories think that essentially salvation is return to the past or return to innocence, and the lack of knowledge is the good part.
Well, to invert that real quick, what's the name of the king of Dreamland? The guy who like dreams so great they made him a king of Dreamland.
In the real world, he's a hobo.
In the real world, he's a hobo. What's his name in the book? I always forget. It starts with
that
C.
I can't remember offhand.
Okay. Well, so the king of Dreamland, also Randolph Carter meets him, and the king of Dreamland says, yeah, Dreamland's great because everything here is function of my dreams, but I'll never be able to go back home to New England because I've died in the real world. I only have a dream self now, and I can never return to the greatness that is the real world. And so, yeah, you're right. That is that thing of there's actually a message in some of the Cthulhu mythos stories of your world and the way it is a beautiful place that you must cherish. And that's supposed to even more so make the horror terrible. The idea that horror might exist not just nearby, but might destroy, your own world. So you need to appreciate your own world, which is definitely not a theme in Vampire.
No, and I mean, it is funny that Lovecraft was afraid of change and the world around him, and he was afraid of essentially growing up and realizing that it's like a Peter Pan story, except kind of dark with tentacles. It's like a kid realizing that, okay, adults do terrible things. Like your dad is a lawyer, but he gets drunk. Whatever. Your mom and dad have sex sometimes. They do terrible, nasty things.
At least
babies
one.
come out. It's in
So.
realizing that, hey, your neighborhood's going to change. Your childhood home is going to be torn down, and people from different backgrounds are going to show up, and the past is glorified as a time when we get innocent and unconscious of the truth. And that is his body horror, is the fact that the world is changing around him. He doesn't want to change himself, and that the acceptance of that truth is somehow destructive to himself, and that annihilation is better than change because then you stay yourself, you stay pure, as it were. This is not, unfortunately, something that you can really run a role-playing game about unless you're running like a one-off, parlor LARP or something, or something that's, you have to really know your players.
Well, and also I think it's the opposite. Like most role players are attracted to a role-playing game because they want they want to be something. The promise of Dungeons and Dragons is worlds of imagination. You can be a sexy kobold. Or like Vampire is the ultimate of that, because Vampire is very much packaged as play yourself, only with awesome vampire powers.
Right, and any story is going to have like a character who changes and grows. That's the main thesis of like any kind of story, and that is in RPGs and the mechanics where your character grows and changes and becomes different. So you can't really have a story about nothing changing necessarily,
right? And that's why I would ask Red about like I think Red already said Vampire doesn't really feel like a horror game. In fact, but I mean also like it's been my experience that people who play Vampire aren't really interested in changing the world all that much, are they? I mean, what do you think about all that?
I think that depends on your players, certainly. And I think the way that I don't, this is a very short tangent, I'm not going to go off on it. I've lately fallen really hard in love with the vampire system, and not because I have any affection for vampires. I actually think they're kind of lame. Don't tell anybody. But but just in the way that game sort of sets up a world that is very reactive, and it's the drama of that world is placed squarely on the players and their actions. And so the way I try to run it is very much of a shifting status quo, where their actions, everything that they do might help them, but it's also going to change how everyone else in town feels about them. So I think that is to its credit.
Well, see, it's funny. It's funny that you say that, because my own experiences with Vampire have been the opposite. That usually when you show up, there's already an entrenched hierarchy. I'm sure Theta can link us to a famous Spoonie video from the 2010s about it, which is that you show up and there's already this rich history of the Tremere are part of this, and the Malkavians are part of that, and the Bruja, and the secret world is completely controlled by them. Every historical event has been vampires. Awesome. And when the adventures are presented to you, they're presented to you with like big, long set piece blocks of go here, meet this vampire, be impressed by how cool this vampire is. They charge you with a task. You go do the task and meet someone else who also has a big, long, and involved history, and all that. Which also I found is awfully endemic to Call of Cthulhu, where I've seen a lot of public adventures are go here, meet this person who tells you about a horror, go to this place, experience the horror, make a bunch of die rolls, and try to stop the horror. And I mean, I'm being very cynical where I said, like, the problem with this is, like, after a while, this linearity of the scenario becomes, I think it starts to sap the horror of it, because you get less obsessed with the stakes of what's going on. Like, I'm not invested in what's going on. I can't feel like I can lose anything. And without that sense of loss, without that sense of I have something to protect, and if I don't protect it, I lose it forever. Without that sense, like if it just becomes a grind of where, well, this is all just, a crapshoot, you lose that feeling.
Yeah. I actually couldn't agree more with you. I can't speak to published adventures, although I could definitely see what you're saying about them probably being sort of like set pieces to show off the established fiction. I haven't run any of those, and I haven't actually even played in a Cthulhu game, but I could see how that might be a trap that people might fall into. But along the lines of if you want, I think would be very challenging to actually inspire real fear in a tabletop game setting. You're surrounded by friends, you're having fun, you're rolling dice, and goofy things are happening. But in terms of if you want to evoke those feelings, I think the only way to do it that would have any kind of emotional or lasting impact is to figure out what your players care about and threaten those things. And that will work in any game setting. In D&D, try stealing your player's bag of holding and see what happens. Suddenly they are much more invested in what's going on.
Right, and a lot of the time with like the insanity systems that we see, it's a lot of telling the players how they ought to feel rather than giving them things to make them feel certain ways.
Yeah, I can't speak to the insanity system, but off the bat, mechanically, that doesn't sound... It sounds like something that might be kind of fun from a roleplay perspective, even if it has problematic elements. But from a horror or even a creepy perspective, I don't see it. What does, I think, inspire horror in Vampire, and the credit that I'll give that game, is the game, when you're creating your character, tells you to create NPCs that presumably your character cares about, that are linked to your vampire's humanity.
See, that must be new, because in previous versions, they did tell you to do your backstory. All right, let me know if they fixed this. One thing that bugs the hell out of me in Vampires, there's one character who's the most important character in the world. Your sire. Now, vampires are immortal. That would mean that most vampires you meet, their sire is still around.
Yep.
But in the early versions of Vampire that I played, at no point does my sire actually play any role in the game as it's going on. In fact, in the computer game, they make a big point of saying, nope, your sire is dead. You're a free agent. You're not a boss to anyone. And that always struck me as like incredibly like violating the truth of Vampire. That it should be that there's a person above you who you owe your very creation to, and by right owns you. And that would be like a big sword hanging over your head and add a lot to the horror, except the game aggressively deletes that.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Griff has something he wants to say, but I do too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just having fun people talk to, and I think that's definitely a problem with like the Masquerade game, because they're definitely trying to set up the protagonist who's free enough to go do things as a video game protagonist, because they have to kind of fit that mold. So that I can see why they kind of make that decision, and then later on you have LaCroix kind of filling the proto position of your new sire who continually gives you out new tasks to go and do it. It's just that he's also the prince. So he's serving double duty. I noticed that when playing or when trying to run different vampire games, there are usually two different levels you try to start out with creating all of these NPCs. You start out with the hierarchy, which is the important part, where you want to have like prince, people underneath them, and stuff like that. And then you want to start from bottom up, where you go, here's the players, who's directly above them, who are their sires, and have them play an important role. But that is entirely upon the person who's running the game, who now has to go ahead and create an entire city worth of characters. And that is a large burden, I think.
And that's why I challenge Vampire's creation process, because your sire should be a specific part. They spend more time on the clan than they do on the sire.
Yeah. I think part of the friction that you guys are bringing up here is this idea of, is it a power fantasy or is it a horror game? If you tell me that I can do anything in this environment, that I can change this world, but then historically I can't because I'm way less powerful than the people above me.
Right.
I think that comes from, that's the monsters in, that's like the D&D monsters in Vampire. In D&D, the challenge is these big beasts that you have to slay. I mean, you can have big beasts to slay in Vampire as well, but the real challenge in Vampire is this power structure that you're supposed to kind of fight against through different means. So I think it needs to be there because that's kind of where the threat comes from. And I don't know. Again, I can only have my own experience to speak from. I actually haven't even done a lot of like actual play viewing of Vampire 5e, so I'm just playing the game differently. But from my interpretation of the text and the rulebook, it seems to me like the game is trying to set up weak spots on your player characters. They come with a lot of baggage, and then they encourage you to use that against the players to create drama. And I think that is probably the closest the game comes to horror, but also I think it's a good approach to take if you're trying to explain horror in a game. And I would, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
What I was going to say, that one of the things I found effective, this is not specific to Vampire. I've never run I played Vampire, played Mage and stuff like that.
Right.
But in one of the things that I found beneficial to starting a horror game is having the characters, or having the players, make characters who are just ordinary. They're a part of their world. They're not specifically making, I'm going to make, Jake Manley, Monster Hunter.
I'm going to make the int/social character.
I'm going to say, okay, everybody, you're all making characters who are students or staff at an English boarding school in 1917. You are all, people living in a fishing village, and you're just ordinary people. And then they are uncovering and discovering the horror. So they're invested already. It's their community, that kind of thing. And one of my other favorite adventures that I've actually wrote myself, to plug myself, is called Chautauqua Fatigan, which is about people. And this is like, it's even set locally at this store. Anyway, I can go into length about it, but they are all people who are taking part in a concert to promote this early 20th century racist idea that existed in Canada called the Northern Ideal. And they're taking part in this concert that's a reaction to the rites of spring, trying to impose force and order on the universe, and then terrible things start happening as they go through it, and they start changing, and they're realizing that, okay, when I'm adapting these horrible opinions, horrible things start to happen. And the one I set at an English boarding school, your characters, you're playing 11 and 10-year-olds, and World War I is going on, so there's this larger horror around them and stuff like this. But just the idea that this is where to tie into what Rabbit was saying about the players are invested in this world and what they could lose by it, because they've created these characters who exist in the world, and they don't exist just to go on hunt monsters or fight horrors.
It's funny that you bring that up, because there's some games that I don't understand, like Weird Wars and Achtung Cthulhu, which takes place in World War I. Which was like, okay, so we've got World War I, and we think adding monsters to it will make it scarier.
Yep.
And,
I feel like
and
someone perhaps misses what the horror of World War One is in that case.
I mean, that's kind of under
Yeah.
that's what I think. Like, you're right that you have to give players a sense that they could lose something. In order, you have to make the horror personal, that you could lose something. Like, a huge problem in Call of Cthulhu is if you don't necessarily build a character who has stakes in what's going on and has something to lose, they might not feel that. And the same thing with Vampire. I mean, a big frustration that I've had with Vampire is that I don't feel there's anything to lose. Like nothing. The clans are not going to disappear. There's nothing we could do. The Tremere, Malkavian, Brujah, whatever, they will never be gone. There is nothing you could do in this game that would actually get rid of these clans because of the way the game is presented. All the players have invested interest in it. They've been around they tried to get rid of them with Requiem and brought them back. So there's this sense that it's a static world that other people are role-playing their power fantasy in. So, I don't feel like I can actually make a change. And that's why I would side more with power fantasy than horror with a game like that. And some of the other versions of Cthulhu, I think the writers are just trying too hard, where it's like, if we just present more horrible things to you, but you're right when you say if it's just a character object, that there have to be other. I think the new Vampire is emphasizing making other people, because, as been pointed out, you can only kill the player character once. You can only do that once. If you're I'm being informed Tremere is gone. Oh no, the one that the licensed world, because if you look at the fine print, World of Darkness was licensing Tremere from an outside party. They deleted that one. I guess they're off with the Lost Mechs of Battletech.
They're still in Masquerade, I think, but yeah, they're not on the new material. They parsed it down to 5 out of
there'd
10.
be a licensing fee. Crazy.
Who would have guessed?
So I guess the only hope is Disney buys them out. Moving on.
No.
I'm welcome to Rafferty being so cynical. I think the reason why, just real quick, I think the reason why Vampire emphasizes making NPCs is because you can kill NPCs. Just like you can threaten to take a sword away from a player in Dungeons and Dragons, you can threaten to take an NPC away from a player, because those can be killed and the game will still continue. And that brings a lot more horror to it.
Yeah. I
Absolutely.
think the powers that you get right in Vampire come at a cost. Everything is you're balancing what you can do, this power fantasy, against what it costs you. And like I said, I think that probably a lot of people are attracted to the game because of the power fantasy, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who run the game as a power fantasy because vampires be sexy. But I think that if you read the text and you try to interpret what they're saying, to me it reads like every time they do something cool, you should show them the bad side of it. Every time they go to recharge their powers, you got to show them you lost control and killed an innocent person, or you're these people that you care about, you are as much of a danger to them as the other monsters that you're trying to stop in these situations. But without a GM that's there to actually push those threads, it's probably, I could see it being all but completely absent from the game that you're playing in. So I'm really curious how Call of Cthulhu, the game, approaches that. The little bit that I've heard about it is it's very skill based. There is that insanity meter, so you're watching things tick down as the pressure increases, and that can create my brief stint with the Alien game, the Alien licensed tabletop game did a similar thing where the tension is building. So I think that's one way that you could do it. But scary tabletop game.
I have noticed a rise in stress. Blades in the Dark, which is the foundation of Forged in the Dark, has a stress mechanic that when it builds, it debilitates your character, and if it builds too many times, you are removed from play. Which was different from, say, Wicked Ones, which we just did in the stream, where in Wicked Ones, when your stress meter builds, you are temporarily removed from play. You'll come back in the next recovery session, but your attributes go up, which is different from Call of Cthulhu, where your attributes almost never go up. and your skills only go up when they're exercised. It's a really, I mean, getting to like World of Darkness, second edition, the 2003 edition, which was the first game I played that actually made you build a normal person, because you had to, like, decide where you came from. You decide your social class, because one of the things that cracks me up is you're completely destitute in that game unless you spend your valuable points on money, which is interesting. But also, this is something like speaking of different theories. So the 2003 version of World of Darkness added morality, which was a controversial rule. And the theory behind morality was, if your character does something considered terrible, such as shoplifting, manslaughter, or genocide, you must then pass a morality saving throw. And if you fail that, you suffer a permanent neurosis, a permanent debility because of that. Now, this is different from sanity. See, sanity, well, like you said, mentioned earlier, was very reactive. It's like, I saw a fish person, now I want to molest plants. Because I saw that and I was assigned dendrophilia or whatever, some random phobia or philia from a random table because I saw something terrible. And that's very reactive and doesn't necessarily apply. I mean, or it could be particular, like you saw a fish person, now you're afraid of fish. I mean, I didn't do anything. I did the adventure and just encountered it.
Yeah.
Whereas when
it's very
playing,
wild magic table. Like, there's fun to be had from the pure randomness of it, and now, like, oh, now how do I incorporate this? But yeah, keep going.
It's fun and silly. Like, it would get one of my favorite Call of Cthulhu stories I would tell is when we broke into someone's house, pitched his plants out the window, killed his cat, and then said, "You have to be careful. There's crazy people out in the woods who want to kill you." But whereas the morality thing I wanted to mention was, I was playing a World of Darkness game, and like there was some kind of guy in the street. He's a monster. He's possessed. He's a wizard. Who knows? He's doing something to my friends, and I'm in a car. I could just run the guy over. If this was any other role-playing game in the world, I would have just run him over. Yeah. But because World of Darkness had that morality question, it was like, well, if I hit him and I kill him, that's manslaughter, which has a chance of debilitating my character forever. Would I want to do that? Like even though I'm sure he's some kind of monster, am I a killer? And that moment was one of my big epiphanies of, now I feel like I'm playing a horror game. Because now, instead of reacting to something telling me bad things are happening and you're going crazy, instead it was, are you willing to do this for the risk of, permanently messing up your character? That, once again, the feeling of loss. That felt more like horror, and I felt more like a real person in that regard. Whereas in Call of Cthulhu, even if I were to write up, Piats like boarding school children, there's more penalty for seeing and discovering things than there is for beating people up and being a violent jerk.
But there is a penalty, though. If you kill somebody, or if you can't, there are sanity losses that will occur. Like first time seeing a corpse, if you kill somebody. The thing is
there's a sanity loss for seeing a dead body. So if I kill him but don't see the dead body, I don't go crazy.
There's less of a sanity. No, if you kill someone, it's a higher sanity loss. But once you've the way that mechanic works is it's a little bit kludgy, but when you've taken all the sanity you can possibly take, let's see that torturing people is a 1d20 sanity loss, first instance.
Mm-hmm.
And once you've lost,
because it used to only be 1 to 3.
Well, let's use that as an example. Probably just closer to 1d6 or something, given all the
I need to stop you right there because while I agree there is a sanity loss for seeing dead bodies and stuff, it's less than seeing the monster. Seeing a fish person is 1d6. Seeing a killing someone is 1 to 3. So there is a sanity loss, but it's trivial compared to encountering the monsters in the books.
This is true. I think I thought it was more than. I believe it's more than 1d3. I'm not sure, but I'll take your word for it. Once you've lost the maximum amount of sanity you can lose from that particular source, from those evil actions or aberrant things you're doing, you stop losing sanity from it, but it's basically it's permanently gone, and you're always a little bit more broken than somebody else. So if you get like somebody who is like, oh, I'm going to play an SS officer, and I've done all sorts of terrible things. These monsters won't scare me. They're going out of the gate with like, presumably a huge sanity loss or something. But in any case, that is not actually really expressed very often in the rules.
To undermine what you just said, it's possible in the new edition of Cthulhu, the 7th edition, to start pre-inured to killing people.
Yes, it is. Yeah, but you start off with a sanity loss essentially.
But it's only 3 points, and which is less than.
It's like 10 or something like that.
No, it's only like 3. It's pathetic.
Right on. I have not really looked at the rules since 5th edition. I know they didn't change that much.
I think though there's an interesting comparison to make though, because along with this inurement and the morality system over in World of Darkness, it kind of starts to reflect the way that you just are playing, rather than being a thing you want to avoid. It's the thing you try to go towards so that you can do more of the activity that you were just doing.
Well, see, that's the thing I'm getting at here with Notes of the Aleph, which is when we talk about technical correctness. It's like what sounds like a good idea often falls apart in the math. My issue with games like Call of Cthulhu or like Eclipse Phase, which implements the sanity of killing someone is less sanity loss than seeing a monster. Which is weird. And then you had the problem in the vampire games, where they had the morality chart, but the problem with the morality chart was they would start putting weird things on it, like preventing someone from becoming a wizard, like denying you magic. Like if you were never a wizard before, and before you emerged, we prevented you from being a wizard, was a worse crime than killing you.
Okay, that sounds like maybe, that's when you like step back and look at it and realize there's inconsistencies in your system.
Right. And that's where I'm always blaming the game, because it's like, if the game set these values, then we as the players, then if you yell at a player for observing the values, you have to ask yourself, like, why are you doing what message does the game want to play? Maybe the people who wrote the game decided that preventing someone becoming a wizard was a worse crime than killing them. So when I kill the guy rather than let him become a wizard, no one can blame me. That was the lesser of two crimes.
Really get into the weeds about like what Mage the Awakening says about this, but I think the general implication is that the mages are a little rare, and having someone suffer by missing an entire part of reality is kind of torturous from their perspective, but that's definitely weird. But if you kill them, you did it anyway.
Yeah, what if Adolf Hitler is going to become a wizard?
Huh.
No, it's suddenly wrong. Yeah, exactly. It's weird.
There's entire sections of the book devoted to jerk wizards.
And I think most of it comes from the way that it wants to set up the antagonists as people who want to do that, keep other people from being wizards so that they get to be the only wizards in control of reality. They want to imply that that's bad and don't do that, so that you have you're naturally against the antagonist.
I mean, I get what they're saying, but the problem is we're starting to get too semantically.
Right. The reason I'm clarifying it is the point that maybe it's not exactly doing what they wanted to do.
But for example, everything Piot said was correct. The idea that no, killing people does make you lose sanity, and mutilations and bodies in front of you makes you lose sanity. My issue was, but when you play the game, you're gonna, I only have to kill 3 humans to get immune to this. I would have to see 6 fish people, and then after I've seen 6 fish people, I have to see 6 ghouls before I'm immune to all of this.
You'd think that once you saw the fish people, the ghouls could be kind of just filed into the whole fish people category. And I would agree with that. Though I would also say that because, I know people who have killed people, like, who are, veterans from the Second World War or whatever, in some cases have killed several people and are very sane people, because that is something, killing and seeing corpses and so on. I know, I have a couple of friends who work as corpse collectors for funeral service companies. So these things are within the realm of what is you're expected to, like they may be unusual for you, but they're within the realm of the human experience. But seeing a fish man coming out of the ocean is something that's completely
makes you question. That makes you question your reality. I can see the logic to that one.
We're talking this in 2021, where people are constantly talking about fake news and secret tunnels. And
To be fair, they were talking about that in 1921 too, though.
Yeah, well, right, and fake, right. So I'm always the naysayer where I'm always questioning. Like, there's already people who believe in crazy stuff. We already brought up the Satanic Panic, which has not gone away. There are people who swear there are secret baby murderers in the woods. Where they're getting the babies and how they're murdering them, and it never shows up in police reports. It's all part of the Illuminati's conspiracy. So, there's already people who believe in this and have position. I mean, I guess I'm getting at here where I'm not from. If you're buying the game as a power fantasy, I'm not really buying where, like how this actually like reinforces the horror mechanically. Like like maybe if a player doesn't know how the rules work and they were told killing people will drive you crazy, would do it. But it's been my experience that when you start playing the game, especially when they're written by people who have written it, they tend to weight the idea that it's a monster. Like a monster that exists would totally shatter your worldview and make you useless for anything. Because remember, sanity makes you useless. Sanity loss, if you lose all of it, makes you useless. Like the entire idea of this, whereas we can get on the internet, we can find people who believe in the Reptoid conspiracy, and they still go to work every day.
I mean, yeah, this is true. But just to say, for example, the example of Satanic Panic, I was raised by ministers, and there was at the time within the church within there was this very big sort of a sensationalist theology coming in about the the physical reality of demons and whatnot. I actually had an exorcism performed on me when I was a small fellow, believe it or not. So when I was growing up, demons were part of my real world. So if I had actually seen one, I would have been like, "Oh shit! Well, I know what to do.
Right.
I'm gonna cast him out in the name of Jesus," kind of thing. This is exactly what I trained for. And there were people who walk around adults who it's within their worldview, so it's okay. They were raised to believe this is true. Whereas when I was 6 or 7 years old or 8 years old, aliens scared the hell out of me. Aliens, those are just that's outside me. Outside it. I mean, demons, oh yeah, whatever. Those guys are around everywhere. That's okay.
Right. We're used to them, yeah.
And that's kind of the weird part. Like I think that's a weird assumption of both Call of Cthulhu and Vampire. The idea that everyone would be driven mad or by the mere suggestion that monsters exist, which like always just rings hollow with me, because there are people, you can meet people today who believe in monsters or would be excited to kill monsters or are prepping to kill monsters. And that sort of archetype is completely unaddressed. Yeah. It's just a de facto assumption that we're all H.P. Lovecraft. Oh no, a frog person might mate with me. I'm so scared.
It comes from a lot of unexamining what the material is and what it's saying. And you need to have your own idea about like, what is the theme of this game? What supports this theme? What am I actually saying when people go through these things?
And I mean, on the surface, it is again one of those things where I talked about how a lot of we'll call it Cthulhu, the game, has a lot more in common with the general lurid pulp genre instead of necessarily with Lovecraft specific, because it does actually map fairly well to the way that insanity is presented in these stories, where people would start raving mad after seeing something strange and run away laughing and so on, or all of a sudden they'd want to like strangle somebody or something just out of the blue. And you can see movies like that where people just like break down and like they see the mummy and then they go crazy immediately, kind of thing.
In theory, that's where Renfield supposedly comes from.
Renfield,
I hung out with a vampire for a couple of years. Now I eat blood.
So I think it's interesting, right? Because you guys just touched on this. If you break down the thematic tension behind what makes a scary story scary, you come away with something a little bit differently, right? To speak on Vampire again, and I'm sorry, this Cthulhu podcast has been dominated by vampires, and that's my bad mostly. But let's talk about it. I think the tension in Vampire, if I was to make a guess at what makes that setting actually scary, is this idea that there are powerful people who are actively harming those under them, and that society is not equipped to deal with it, which is a very real, if you've paid attention to politics for the past 10 years, that's a very real thing. That is a serious tension. And I think it's all over that book. It sounds like from my exposure to H.P. Lovecraft, and we brought this up at the beginning of the podcast, a lot of the actual fear there is this loss of innocence, or this tension that the world is changing and it's outside of our power to control it. And then what Piat just said, which I think is really astute, is that that didn't get part of the package. When people decided to turn these into games, they grabbed the tentacles and the fish people and the weird sexual perversion, and they bundled up that.
Yeah.
But I wonder, so how would you go about constructing a game that captured those actual horror tensions? Because I think that's the root of what makes any scary story actually scary. Underneath the chainsaws and the tentacles, there's got to be some sort of real world tension there.
Oh, well, I think Piat hit it on the head, where Piat said that he deliberately structures his adventures to make sure that there's people in them that you actually care about if they live or die. But like,
right. Or a setting of innocence that does get destroyed over the course of the story, right?
I mean, people, and I guess by innocence, ignorant people who would not know how to deal with this horror. And if you don't stop this horror in time, people will suffer, and you care about whether those people suffer or not. I mean, I have to emphasize that last part, because like a lot of, I've been in too many Call of Cthulhu games, and to some extent Vampire the Masquerade games, where we don't care if entire city blocks get blown up. It's, emergence. It's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder. It's interesting, I think, because now I'm thinking about like, and this is going back, but we were talking about the loss of like so if you want to talk about loss, and loss equals scary, then, it's really, you're talking about what can you get your players to care about, right? And maybe you do that through a very grounded real world setting, like the boarding house example. Maybe you do that through, I'm very interested about doing that through mechanics. I was thinking another thing that Vampire does, the real price you pay for all of it, is your hunger, your bloodlust goes up, and the actual penalty for your bloodlust going up is kind of like your insanity meter, where you lose agency, you lose play agency. Your character takes on traits that you can't control, and then you have to roleplay your character as being like paranoid or a rage monster or something, which is fun in its own way, but is another form of loss that the players would care about. They care about their control over their own character, and if you take that away a little bit, that is a penalty. That can be frightening. So I wonder how you would like update the Call of Cthulhu game to maybe mechanically represent what makes the Cthulhu mythos so terrifying, beyond just having more like another hit point thing. I guess. I'm just thinking out loud. But what do you guys think? I wonder.
Raph, do you want to talk about the some of the mechanics you put in through the our occult horror book?
Yeah.
Well,
I was going to reference them myself, so go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, to be a little biased here, so Piat and I work together because Piat and I, have a lot of bona fides when it comes to Call of Cthulhu and investiture and that. And so naturally, since Piat, as you can hear, is very steeped in the pulp era, and I wanted to go back to what made that excitable. So this actually grew out of a role-playing game. Yeah, thank you. And this actually grew out of a role-playing game that a lot of people don't have fond memories of, but no one seems to play, Marvel Superheroes. Because Marvel Superheroes had the idea that if you were a wizard, like Doctor Strange, you got your power from two different places, either yourself or from other things. So, when he invokes the Iron Bands of Belaro, he is invoking Belaro, who then does things. In the original comic books, he used to invoke Dormammu all the time until he found out, wait, you're evil, I'll stop invoking you. And this idea that you had a contract with powers higher than you. Hey, that might sound familiar if you're used to Vampire the Masquerade, but notice their mage game and pointedly their vampire game, you don't ask other people for power, you do everything yourself.
Right.
And in Call of Cthulhu, you power, despite the fact that Hastur the Unspeakable can gift you with extra powers, or Eort can make a bargain with you, none of these actually give you special abilities. They only, drive you crazy or kill you. wizardry comes from burning your internal PowerPoints and stats. So the idea was with our occult horror game, we came up with the idea that you could ask other entities to do things for you. Like, hey, I want to destroy stuff. So Piot came up with the silent ones, which are our version of the Eldritch Horrors. And instead of being neutral players, like, okay, you may have heard the phrase, we are those who once were and will be again. That's from The Evil Dead. And The Evil Dead has the Necronomicon in it. So it's influenced by Cthulhu, but notice the way Evil Dead works. There are evil forces that want entry into our world, and the Necronomicon, by reading that, lets them in. So these aren't neutral forces or eldritch forces beyond our understanding. They hate you, or they want you because they want your bodies and they want to inhabit them and do bad things. And so, obviously, like you said, I don't want to lose my sword. I don't want to lose my NPC. I especially don't want to lose my body. It's where I keep all my organs.
That's my agency, man.
Right. And it's very horrifying in Evil Dead. It's also horrifying in zombie fiction. You don't just die in a zombie movie. You also become a monster.
Yeah.
And nobody wants that. Don't let them bite me. That's a palpable horror that people were into. And so delving into this, I think more into some of the other people like Derleth and Ashton Smith. We're Ashton Smith fans, right?
Yeah, Clark Ashton Smith. Yeah,
yeah, shout out for Ashton Smith, my favorite. So we went into the idea that you have to do things to make other entities happy. And then the best part is Piot wrote up a bunch of horrible entities that want you to do horrible things. So
right, and I think an interesting part of it is that the more that those entities like you and the more they hate someone else, that you get even more powerful as long as you're targeting people they don't like.
Right, but you have to become a more...
Which creates some tension.
You lose less agency over what the actions you can take are. I think there's another, actually, just to slightly interject, I've seen other mechanics in other games where the more interaction you have with the terrible powers from beyond or whatever, the stranger you become and people start to notice. So it becomes more difficult to have interactions with other people, like with other, with normal humans. You get like negative modifiers or whatever, and then eventually people are just like, they look at you and they know something's wrong with you. You're sort of like, what's the phrase you would Grendel about? He was like wearing God's anger kind of thing, like a big ugly hat or something.
Yeah, and I wanted to draw on like the Haunter in the Dark, the guy who's scared, like, hey, an eyeball monster noticed me, is going to come kill me. He did something, got the attention of something that he can't destroy, and then it came to eat him. Or the Thing on the Doorstep, which is where this guy is worried about his friend because apparently a body-stealing wizard has come back to life, and he thinks the body-stealing wizard is going to steal his friend. Or maybe he doesn't think this because that's what he's hearing. He's hearing all these stories. It's like, hey guys, I'm going to write down all these stories because I don't know if my friends are nuts or not, but this is just weird. I'm writing all of this down. He doesn't believe any of it until the Thing on the Doorstep shows up. Spoilers. So, but it was the idea that when you get attention of these horrible things and what they're up to, they might actually do something to hurt you. And so that's when we came up with the reverse of the petition power, which was if you invoke, like if I invoke Gamagin's name to destroy you, and Gamagen already hates you, then I get extra spell dice to destroy you because you were pissing off Gamagen. How did you piss off Gamagen? Well, we went to the baby sacrificing ritual that Gamagen asked us to do, and you interrupted it. This means Gamagen currently hates you because you interrupted something he wanted. And so now you're on the shit list. And so the evil beings become more powerful in proportion to how much you're interfering, which goes back to what you see in a lot of horror stories of people saying, yes, I was involved in this horrible thing, but then I changed my name, moved to another town, got a new job and a new identity because I want nothing to do with this, which is a very common trope you see in stuff like, 60s and 70s, like Stephen King type stuff. Or later horror stories of movies of they'll meet like the one stranger who knows the entire story and said, I thought I'd never have to see this again. Guess I got to burn down my house and move again because I'm not screwing with Gamagen. And that felt more, that's the tack we went because we wanted more horror. It gets a little more in line with, I think, what's supposed to be going on in Vampire the Masquerade, where you don't want to be investing in... You don't want to piss off the elders above you, like especially older vampires who are more powerful than you are, who aren't in the limelight or are busy playing fourth dimensional chess, because you don't want to get their attention because they could squash you.
Yeah.
And while I agree that's in the text, because this text is written by dozens of people, that's not what they sell people. Because you get to the gaming table and everyone's all hip, attractive, rich vampires, posing around. Like, that's why it's not a horror game, it's a power fan. That kind of thing of I'm a pawn of someone, especially my own sire, who wouldn't have brought me up because I'm a tax burden, the blood tax burden of merely existing, and ordering around as a pawn. That's why Vampire is like not a horror game. It's a power fantasy game, because this idea of you're a pawn that needs to struggle to merely survive is not an issue in Vampire.
Unless you make it an issue. But I agree. I think that's a limiting factor of a lot of these games too, is the power fantasy. I have a player who I love dearly, but it stands out to me. He's one of the few people who I think was cut out to run these kinds of Eldritch horror games or play in them, because there's no shred of power fantasy to this guy. He is just there for the creepy, the cerebrally terrifying, like the existential horror. And when I'm about to actually start playing a game that he's running, and I'm really excited because this dude is a master of that stuff. But I think that generally speaking, what attracts a lot of people to these games and how they sell themselves is on the power fantasy. But that's weird, because from my understanding, we were looking at demographics for Roll20 recently, and they're several years out of date now, but Call of Cthulhu made it on like the top 10 or top 5 in almost every category. And I would always assume that Call of Cthulhu would be the opposite of a power fantasy game. From what I understand, it's a game about watching characters burn down, which sounds really cool, but is not the same thing. But maybe it sells itself on the shooting tentacles with shotguns.
Right.
Fantasy.
The player characters have guns. When it comes to the vampire universe, the elders are still physical beings who can be murdered to death if you really want to, or you have enough people, or you exhaust them to some degree. In fact, they're even more vulnerable than you realize. When it comes to Cthulhu, you have a bunch of monsters, and then, of course, in our notes here, Tim Cook, or Cook, put a CR on Sachawa. Well, how do you pronounce that one? We have notes here.
You mean Monty Cook, not
Monty
Tim Cook.
Cook.
That's
the first Cook I thought
and
of.
you're
I'm
talking
sorry.
about Tizlithagwa. It's actually a Thagwa, but when we come to knock on your door to threaten you, people would ask, "Who is it?" And he would say, "Tizlithagwa."
Right, so you could go ahead and in Call of Cthulhu, you can go kill it. Why? Because you can now.
You're not supposed to be able to, and they make it very hard. But I have to say, in my own Call of Cthulhu games that I ran in like high school, university, one of the players was playing like the gym teacher at Miskatonic University, and he picked up a sledgehammer, which did 3d6 damage, and he had a plus 1d6 damage bonus, so he was doing 4d6 damage. So he killed one of the 900 forms of Nyarlathotep with a sledgehammer.
Well, to be fair, now
perfectly
is just giving you the win to make you think that you won. So
exactly, but it's the whole issue of if you give it hit points, your players are going to kill it somehow.
Absolutely, yeah. Once you start,
you're going to drive a boat into Cthulhu, basically.
I would forward that, and this is going to be incredibly cynical. The reason Call of Cthulhu is very popular because it's based off of BRP, basic role playing, which is RuneQuest, which, by the way, there's a ton of BRP based RPGs out there. There's even a version of Traveler, I think, that does it, because the version of Traveler does everything. Of course. But Call of Cthulhu has been around for a long time, and if you wanted to play a game where you were playing normal people, like normal people in some sort of normal situation or slightly fantastic situation, your options have been extremely limited. Like D20 Modern died on the vine back in the early 2000s. And even then, you read through that book and it's got, like we were complaining about, stats for kobolds and gnolls in it. Like the guys who wrote it didn't seem to know what to do with it and has almost no support. So it disappeared. There were games like GURPS that are also dead. GURPS 4th edition died in 2007. And even then, they were a mess of huge rules that you had to mess through. So for a while, there were, I guess, two pretenders to the throne, which are World of Darkness, specifically the 2004 edition, the World of Darkness. You could buy that as a standalone RPG, and they sold standalone horror adventures that went with it. So you could play World of Darkness with normal, not vampires, not mages, not hunters, normal people going on horror adventures with another book. One-stop shopping. Okay, which I did. for a couple of years, and it was awesome.
Yeah.
Or you could play Call of Cthulhu, which has been updated to several different eras. It has a good character creation system that has people with real jobs, intelligence, education, like skills that real people would have, like, library use, credit rating, that
Credit
sort of
rating
thing.
is a huge skill in Call of Cthulhu, yeah.
And it has a lot of material around it that's grounded in reality. Plus, it's also simple to understand. It's like, hey, my credit rating's 60%. How often does it work? So it was these were the two things that you could adapt. And I think Vampire, like World of Darkness, they kind of pushed it as a game because they definitely presented it as a horror game standalone, because World of Darkness was a standalone book. And they did present it, and I think they did make serious inroads. Like I said, there were books like some of the mysterious horror adventures, and books like The Armory that were presented as just for normal people.
Well, that was the cool. I mean, it's an interesting approach, right? Because they said, okay, what if all of these guys shared a universe, our vampires, our mages, our werewolves, but then we created the core book that all of these other creatures would be like expansions onto, right? But then that core book, they could have left it there, but they said, no, maybe we'll just make a game where you can play normal people with ghosts in it. It's interesting. I don't know how it actually ended up. I mean, I guess they've kind of gone back on that now, years later, and everything is its own game again. But that was an interesting idea.
Yeah, I'm not. So Vampire 5th edition is standalone now. It has all the rules in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm just looking at here. Yeah, which is kind of a bummer. Well, the whole generic system idea kind of disappeared because people are confused. It's like, what do you mean this isn't a game? I gotta buy another thing? Because you hear people complain, I gotta buy DLC? What?
Yeah.
So, and which of course makes all the additions confusing. That
is true in this case.
So when people are saying like Call of, and also like this begs the question, when they say Call of Cthulhu is popular, which one? There's at least 7 editions, more by certain countings. So
these editions are fairly backwards compatible and similar, though. I would say.
I mean, like I can technically say Tetris is the most popular video game. I mean, true.
But of course, which one?
Right, but which version, which one were you playing? And like, when we get together, it's like how when everyone's played Tetris where you're playing it right now. Like that's a question. Call of Cthulhu is pretty popular because it has an immediacy that's easy to understand. And also, like, you just heard all of us arguing about different interpretations. Like, I may be mad at Call of Cthulhu, but I can still run it. And Piat, sees a lot of joy in it that he can express, things like Prep School or Chautauqua Racist Festival Adventures or stuff like that. I mean, it's still one of the few games that you can drop true history into. Like, you could pick any era, and there are games that do it, because it's Octon Cthulhu, it's Delta Green. You could pick 50s, 60s, 70s, and easily stat out an era for gaming in it that you couldn't necessarily do with anything else. Like D20, you couldn't do it because, like Dungeons and Dragons, because they're too. It's too monster crunchy. It's like either you'd have too many hit points and you'd be bouncing bullets off of your face, which wouldn't feel realistic. And also, like, it doesn't have, it's so focused, half of it and more is devoted to combat. Whereas in Cthulhu, combat's kind of an afterthought and will probably kill you.
With the exception of Delta Green, I think. Delta Green is sort of the explicit power fantasy Call of Cthulhu.
Well, and Delta Green, but this gets into, I could do a whole different cast on how, how to survive in old school games, because some of us got to 20th level, damn it. World of Darkness, I think, had a lot of potential with it, but their crowd wanted to play cool vampires. And so you can see that they gave up on the idea of World of Darkness being a replacement for Call of Cthulhu and have thrown in completely with vampire, werewolf, and mage, hunter, and basically have given up on the idea of normal people.
It's a supernatural, sitcom, or not sitcom, but like soap opera or something, basically. Which is fine. It's a very playable and interesting. I just wonder, we have examples of like Call of Cthulhu done right in whatever media, and I'm curious as to if anyone has seen the most recent film version of Color Out of Space. or The Color from Space.
No, I haven't seen that yet. I hear good things.
It is actually quite good, and it's interesting because I think it gets the whole idea of loss and change right. And somebody was going to call up my notes.
Yeah, like some people were pointing out that like something that I didn't realize was a theme of the original story, but now I do. Is like if you owned this land, or more importantly, had a mortgage on this land, okay, and something weird happens to it, you can't just up and leave. Like especially, you know, so the people who are forced to deal with it. And at first, it doesn't seem that bad either, because people forget that when the color first shows up in the story anyway, the crops all go faster.
Yep.
I have seen the 1970s version with Sheriff Lobo in it.
I've seen that as well. I actually used to show that at screening rooms at conventions in the 90s, in the olden days.
Yeah, it's not terrible.
No, it's not. And I mean, it's a take on it. But so this recent version, I at first was sort of like, okay, this is interesting. I'm not sure I like it. And then the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. Because you've got, first of all, the casting Nicolas Cage as a dad, and Nicolas Cage is does not have a dad energy. I think we can all recognize that for the most part. He can be an excellent actor, but he's so off-putting at the beginning that his character's descent into, spoilers, insanity is not interesting. But then you realize that he's been off all along, because the whole theme of the movie is he is trying to get back to a lack of knowledge, back to the innocence. He wants his family to be back, where his wife loved him and they were both deeply in love. His son was like a cute nerd, and his daughter was like a loving child, like the outdoors. And instead of them being like, secretly teenagers, and his wife is frustrated with the decision to move to the country, and his character is his father who's desperately trying to keep his family together, while being unable to recognize his own efforts to do so right from the beginning of the movie are increasing the entropy, decay, and chaos, and driving them away. And then after The Color from Space shows up, the alien meteorite shows up, he's still doing the same thing, except this time there's like, interdimensional brainworms and
it's like
all sorts of stuff going on. But it's the same thing, and it's explicitly shown.
To being a family, just us and the brainworms.
Yeah, it's explicitly shown in the movie. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and and I think I would hit the nail that saying like, okay, if the core of Cthulhu style horror is the idea of people wanting to go back to an innocent state before they knew something different, that is going to be the ultimate uphill battle when it comes to, or I even say an impossibility, in tabletop role-playing game, because that's not why people come to tabletop role-playing games. They come to learn a game that will then let them experience some sort of fantasy. Like World of Darkness, it's like, hey, World of Darkness is the opposite of that. Hey, isn't it awesome that you're a vampire now? You've got cool vampire powers, and you know this cool society. Don't tell anyone else.
Let's go talk about our waning morality over at this cool dance party.
It's a cool secret club that only we're allowed into, because no one else knows it's a masquerade.
Nice trench coat, bro.
Yep.
You can sleep with anyone because it's zipperless.
Oh yeah. So that's why people think wouldn't classify that. And I think while those are good as horror themes, I really think that in a tabletop, I think the idea of a return to innocence or a maintain of innocence is going to be a lost cause. Whereas the horror of loss, the idea that what you like love or care about could be changed or destroyed permanently, that could work. And I think that's where the sanity loss mechanic was trying to come from, but it's implemented in the most brute force way. It's like a hit point track that just goes down and penalizes you for playing the game. The idea that eventually, instead of just giving you this timer that the game will, the more you play this game and the more you experience, your character will die sooner. There were better ways to implement that than just the sanity meter, and it really needs to go.
And I think, in a sense, I think you'd have to have a very specific group. It would have to be catered to that group, because of the power fantasy, the good versus evil thing, the very black and white sort of plot. That's like a very easy hook to hang your hat on. And everybody's going to come to that with the same experience, and they're going to have fun. Delta Green, I think, is like that. It's more like, hey, we're all secret agents, but we fight monsters, and we know the secret truth.
Yeah. And we showed up with guns.
who showed up with guns. Yeah. Part of me thinks that you could run like a very Cthulhu game would be running just a straight D&D game, power fantasy, where gradually as time goes on, you realize that, oh my God, these kobolds and goblins are just actual real people with like culture and stuff who mean us no harm, and we're just kind of stomping all, getting an awareness of that everything, when you're trying to hold on to things and just keep things the same, you're damaging the world around you, kind of thing. But who wants to play that, right?
Well, a lot of people do. And that's where I have a primary bug up my butt, whereas I'm not welcome, because we streamed Call of Cthulhu on the Raktus channel. And the problem I always have is, like you said with the sledgehammer earlier, the correct way to solve a Cthulhu problem is to just kill it. You just get out your firepower and you just kill it. It's statted. It can die. And it's like, well, what if you fail? But it's so dangerous. It has a tentacle that can kill you instantly. It's like, well, yes, if it hits me, I die, and then I've lost, which you already told me I was going to happen to me anyway. So I have nothing more to lose. This is Resident Evil now. This is, but if I do succeed, and the problem is because the weapon damage is so high, and the monsters aren't statted right, and like if you've read the rules of Cthulhu, I can fire guns 3 times a turn. Because the game is so deadly, you can kill anything that you meet in it. And so the correct solution is to kill everything. And one of the goals we had when we were writing Occult Horror for Urban Jungle was, I don't like the idea of a horror game where you solve things by killing them. I think once you've decided that combat can solve all of our problems, it's not a horror game anymore, it's a combat game. Like, you wouldn't call Dungeons and Dragons a horror game, but you can get killed instantly in Dungeons and Dragons too. Any fight you get into, you could get killed. There's monsters that have one-hit kill powers. You could die instantly. So you wouldn't think of that as a horror game. And so to make a game feel horrible, there has to be the idea of permanent loss that you can't solve through the first brute force problem. The brute force solution of just wailing on it. That things are more complicated and sacrifices might have to be made.
Okay, so I got a question to tag off of that, because sometimes I feel like I'm alone here. So maybe if anybody else feels this way, you can let me know. But does anyone have fun from like the opposite of a power fantasy? Because what I think intrigues me about the notion of a game like Call of Cthulhu, and maybe partly like with the old school revival thing that we talked about as well, is this idea that part of the fun isn't necessarily being a badass that kills the tentacle monster, but more like watching a character sort of get destructed, like cave in on themselves, lose limbs, lose sanity, change into something else as a result of the experiences that they had. I feel like that's really interesting to me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of my characters end up that way just because it's fun to kind of play the person who can view things normally and then be terrified or horrified at what's happening in front of them. Way back when, I was playing a Shadowrun game runs, which, as you may notice, is not a horror game, but one of the missions, my troll was in a perfectly ordinary sedan they had to squeeze into and drive, and then a cyborg brainwashed assassin with mono whip popped in through the roof into the passenger seat. At this point, I stated my first action was that the troll was going to scream. Yeah. Because this is not a good situation. It is fun to put yourself into those situations and just kind of roll with like the horrible things that are happening to your character. The everyman is a staple narrative piece of fiction. And having someone who can bring that back and say, look, guys, this is all really ridiculous, is fun.
Well, emergence is always fun. And you pointed out wild magic earlier. And also, of course, we're masochists who love to see horrible things happen to our characters. Piot and I have both played Rolemaster.
Yes.
And Piot...
5 lives lost for 3 people in one combat.
Yeah, and Piot, being a bigger masochist, has played Hackmaster.
I was one of the only Canadian certified GMs.
Right. These are games. I wish this had happened to me, but we used to have a guy in our Rolemaster game named Lucky. Lucky was missing one eye, missing 2 fingers on one hand, badly burned all along his right hand side, had at least 12 scars, and was missing 33% of his soul.
Just 33%.
That's
So-
very
It's
specific.
not precise. He's missing 33%.
That's the result of a really good negotiation.
No. That's this is Rollmaster. That's just spells.
It's just spells. Okay.
That's
So
just
what
the
do
monster.
Yeah, there's actually definitely the loss of character agency and ability and stuff like that. That like, and kind of fighting a losing battle. That's attractive to a lot of people. I've had people. I used to run the Warhammer fantasy role playing game, and I had a couple of players in that group who were really into the idea that they were just basically struggling against the warp. Like the Chaos Stone
Oh
was
gosh,
that sort of thing.
Warhammer
And
Fantasy Mutation stuff is fantastic. It's so fun.
They enjoyed it, but I mean, they enjoyed it in a, well, also not in a gleeful way, but it's just that failure is always more interesting than success, kind of thing.
Mhm.
Thank you. Yes,
That's always my
agree.
problem with D&D. Is like, okay, you get up to level 20, and now you got a flying castle and a magic hat and all these other things, and that's fun on some level, but it gets kind of boring.
I'm gonna just
It's fleeting fun.
I'd rather run like a hard Scrabble. Like you get. I used to call it a game where if somebody pushed you down the stairs, it would hurt. So a lot of games, it doesn't. That's not a threat.
I gotta
you pop back up again.
You guys all say failure is more interesting than success, and then you all buy the books with Elminster and Drizzt.
I don't have any of those books. I have Gored the Rogue. Oh wait,
you have Gored the anyway. But
and I play D&D with encumbrance, so
Well, we all hate fun, folks. You all know that. No, I mean, I will agree that working within constraints to get. Well, I mean, this is the summary of everything I stand for here in Notes of the Aleph, which is working within restraints, or limitations can be fun. Period. New sentence. Therefore, stop yelling at your minimaxers, because that's what they're doing. But tangentially related to that, the problem, while it can be a lot of fun, like going out there and getting your head blown off and throwing yourself at monsters and getting killed, that can be a lot of fun. But that's not horror. I'll say the issue is, like, to be horror, you would actually have to be scared or frightened of losing something.
Right.
And when you don't. People keep forgetting that in old school game design, it takes 5 minutes to roll up a character, and you're not even supposed to choose things like your class. If you're playing play game, you don't even do that. And so you rolled the character up randomly and churned through a dozen of these until you came up with one that was survivable. And in the interim, you might do crazy stuff. Like, that also means, like, that's the opposite of world building. It's like, I don't care about your stupid big stories and, whether you have lore and whether there's like a big timeline. Like, especially if I play the Vamp, we need to put this link in the summary of the story. Spoonie's story, when he played Vampire, Spoonie didn't care if he died. So Spoonie goes out and as a vampire blows up an entire city block. He doesn't care about the repercussions. It's fun to lose. But from a certain perspective, Spoonie has completely undermined everyone else's fun in the game. And he, that's definitely what I say. That's not like a horror situation. I think that's one of the big issues when it comes to displaying horror in role-playing games, is because if you don't care if you live or die, then you're not scared.
Fair enough. So hope, maybe the potential that you might be able to kill the Eldritch Horror with a hammer, maybe that is an important ingredient in this whole equation. Not just for player engagement, but also to give them a reason to build a character that they care about, is the off chance that maybe they could succeed, and that is what they're risking as they play.
Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't call Paranoia a horror game, but Paranoia has all the elements you've just described. We do crazy things, and failure is fun.
I reference not found. I gotta look up this Paranoia thing.
You'd love it anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
We could do a whole podcast on Paranoia because its origins are great.
So we've definitely gone ahead and covered that. Part of it is making sure that there's a threat to the player and that it feels real and that they're going to lose something. But another part of being in the RPGs here is that you're in a group of people who aren't really scared and helpless, but in fact are highly intelligent, encouraged to work together, and probably already have a plan. So how do you take this scenario where you can't really isolate this group from each other and then make them feel like they're under a threat that is harder than they can handle without
So,
necessarily
huh.
murdering them instantly or throwing them into a fight?
So, I was actually thinking about this earlier, but I didn't want to interject because it was kind of a non sequitur. But maybe it fits here, because I was trying to think of what I think are the kind of horror storytelling tropes that you could work into a role-playing game setting. And I was thinking about the stuff that I particularly really enjoyed from the H.P. Lovecraft. I guess probably very specifically Cthulhu, I think, which is at slight odds with the the urban jungle occult approach, where you guys were like, we have these deities, but they they're going to come back and make it personal for you. I think by contrast to the Cthulhu thing, part of what makes that so frightening is that Cthulhu doesn't even know you exist. Just by it existing, your reality is being warped. You are an ant on the shoe of this thing. And so I was thinking like having a staple of what I consider to be eldritch horror is this idea that the world around you is quietly going crazy. There are patterns of things that don't make sense immediately, but it's clear that something with incredibly great influence is changing the world that you live in subtle ways. And I think that would be a really cool thing to work into a Cthulhu story. If I was going to try running one, I would go for that. That's like that the King in Yellow, right, is another one where, hey, everything is as it seems. You're going to your Sunday school, but there's something weird about what they're teaching the kids at Sunday school. And
In the Mouth of
spreads.
Madness
In the
is,
Mouth of
I
Madness,
think, yeah, would be the text for that, because
Hmm.
it's a film. It uses the tropes of filmmaking, and because it's a movie and it's very cool media, you can just sit there and experience it. Um, it starts to do things that are just off-putting, like the same police brutality scene shows up over and over again. The ripped poster in the background, the painting in the background of a hotel is different each time the main character looks at it. Or
Yeah.
my favorite subtle thing in the movie, next time, if you it's not a spoiler if you watch it, notice that people's eye color changes to blue. You don't notice that. And someone had to point this out to me, but in certain scenes, people have lenses in their eyes that have changed their eye color to blue, but only in certain scenes and not in every scene.
Oh, I like that a lot.
It's or the other urtext to this, the game that inspired like Silent Hill and every other modern horror computer game you've ever seen, Jacob's Ladder.
I haven't
Right.
seen that.
Jacob's Ladder, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I feel bad recommending it because you've seen it already, because you've seen
It's
Silent
been
Hill.
it's been so referenced by other stuff. I've heard it and it's been recommended to me before. I just had never got around to it.
You have to go in the spirit of watching it that this is the movie
Yeah.
everyone else is ripping off. So you've seen, but it's got dreamlike imagery. And
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, just while it's in my head before the thought goes away, that what you're talking about, Rabbit, this is a sort of the world is changing in subtle ways that are unsettling to you. Again, is a very core Lovecraftian, core weird horror thing, and it comes from. Okay, so H.P. Lovecraft, whereas people don't necessarily realize that, he was actually a very avid amateur scientist. He was really big into astronomy. He wrote astronomy zines. He corresponded with guys at Cornell and Brown University. A great deal. And a lot of his friends were scientists. And at this period in history, the Newtonian universe was changing. The Victorian universe, the rules the Victorians had put in place, their explorations of science, were also changing, and things were starting to not make sense anymore. You got the theory of relativity, Einstein, and there was a
different speeds. What?
Yeah, well, there was a larger pushback against this, and people actually thought it was an invidious attempt to dethrone the basic order of the universe.
Hmm.
Like, and you see this is explicitly stated, like in the 20s and 30s, and this is kind of a tie into the Astounding Science book that we wrote, just released. For example, the Nazis didn't like Jewish science.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like quantum mechanics. They didn't like the theory of relativity, because it could have threatened the order there was. And that was something that H.P. Lovecraft, he was realizing that we couldn't define what the universe was. We couldn't set these rules up. And so the things he had learned and cherished as true, the next generation of kids who were learning science were learning something different. And I mean, this is something that we're talking about, certain things are suddenly different. This is something that all parents experience too. Their kids go to school and they're learning new math.
Yeah.
They're learning that the gays are okay and that gender identity isn't tied to your biological sex.
Right, and
all these terrifying things that are coming out, and they scare people a lot.
You
and
can see
that is like the core of Lovecraft. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I mentioned Stuart. That's Stuart Gordon's take on Cthulhu.
Okay.
He's mostly famous for From Beyond.
Okay.
Which is the really sexy Call of Cthulhu. It's the one with all the pink light, where the idea behind it is, oh no, the monsters are here. They're in the room right now. You want to see? I got a machine that shows them to you.
Right? That was another great story. What was that?
What's From Beyond based off of? But yeah, the theory behind it is that there are monsters and they exist, but they won't harm you unless you know they exist. By the way, I just told you they exist. Good luck sleeping tonight.
Exactly. They can see you now.
So I think like tangentially off of the like quote fear of the unknown is sort of like the idea that you can't possibly know something. And I think there might still be a small space where maybe you could still make that work as a theme without it being horrible.
Well, and actually,
because there are things that are, in fact, outside of your basic ability to experience. We only see a small amount of light. We only hear a certain amount of sounds. So yeah, maybe there's just some invisible thing around you that, doesn't hurt you until you know about it.
And there are 2 RPGs, I think, that do that. Okay, the first one is, I think this is woefully out of print, is the Golden Dawn book for Call of Cthulhu, which was the idea that we were all members of the Golden Dawn. Because, like I mentioned in Call of Cthulhu, if you've got guns, you can defeat most monsters. But the other thing is, well, okay, so in Call of Cthulhu, casting spells drives you crazy. And you have to have a power stat in the game to cast spells. Well, what if we all got together and did this on purpose? Like if once we, spells always cost insanity, but monsters don't always cause it. And the only way to get better at magic is to specifically, this is hilarious, you have to specifically invoke a monster that is more powerful than you. It's got to have a higher power stat than you. Then you have to get into a binding contest with it, which is always less than 50-50 because it's more powerful than you. Then if you succeed, there's a random chance that your power stat goes up. This is one of the few ways in the game you can become more powerful. So in the Golden Dawn RPG, you're a bunch of annoying wizards who have a special little house where you summon things too powerful for you to control, specifically for the purpose of attempting to control it. And then if you're successful, hooray, I've got a monster. But then again, most of these things are just monsters. What are you going to do with them? Just set them loose in the populace? You don't have a reason for that.
Right. So, but I mean, like, even mechanically, that sounds difficult to run because either your session like goes on for 4 hours or it ends 20 minutes in with a successful binding.
Well, it can go a lot faster if you're all like we trust me. After a while, we got this down to a science, and then your enemies are the other people who are also doing this. Also, let's not forget the occasional mishap where you call down something, and also if you've played the Arkham Horror game, this shows up more in what's the Arkham Over the World game? It's not Arkham Horror. It's
Eldritch Horror. Eldritch
Horror, which I think is a better version.
It's one of my favorites.
You start getting into the Eldritch Horror situation where we're going to Carcosa or we're going through time and space, and then you wind up having adventures in those places, which is almost always bad news because why would you go to a place that didn't have forbidden knowledge? I mean, so that was a game I think they did it really well and could use a revival because, but it was definitely the mere act of questing for more power is calling down bigger and badder and nastier things. Like, you're doing it. You could stop. You don't have to do this. The other game I think that did a reasonably good job of it is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition, which I know Griffin has played.
Yep, and Ryan.
because there's excellent moments in that. Like one of my favorite things is like there's dark magic. Dark magic. Roll an extra die every time you cast a spell. Cool. Why would I not want that? And the answer is, well, because every time you roll doubles or triples or quadruples, something bad happens. But I
Sounds like the 666 ruling for necromancy and Ironclaw.
Right, which is the inspiration for it, I think.
Yeah.
do I constantly talk about how great Warhammer Fantasy roleplay is? But also, like, it's usually a bad thing when you roll doubles or triples. But there's one funnier thing in where is the way you can learn dark magic and other things that let you roll more dice is their results on the magic curse table. So the curse could be creature shows up, you get blasted, you get cursed. Hey, would you like to learn dark magic? It's a permanent improvement to all of your magic forever. Which
I do love those mechanics.
it means you're rolling more dice, which means you're more likely to blow up. That's like those little tiny things that are built into the second edition game make it feel like, you know, hey, would you like some more power? And that was we also deliberately built that into occult horror, where there's lots of spells. Or like, hey, how would you like, you know, how would you like to be able to summon more creatures? Or, you know, how would you like, you know, just more dice to roll? It's more dice. Who doesn't love more dice?
Yay, dice.
And we really need more of that. That grew out of our frustration with, like, comparing this to, say, Rollmaster. Where Rollmaster, like you said, failure can be funny, but the problem with Rollmaster is you can fail any roll. Like all rolls are open-ended. You roll an 01, you roll again. Oh no, I cut myself shaving. Roll on the E-crit table.
It's like the high elf from my game who tried to collect a bird's egg for a spell and ended up being poked in the eye by a blue jay and losing his eye and falling around the tree and dying. Yeah. But
yes, so
Nice.
in other words, it wasn't proportional, and that doesn't make it feel like horror. That makes it feel like comedy.
yes, slapstick.
And so one of the things I think that's underserved in horror role-playing games is the idea of what I want to call rope, which is the idea that the more you push yourself, the more likely it is to blow up in your face. And rope doesn't work very well in gaming because you'll have min-maxers. Like Shadowrun, the early editions, like first and second edition, you could summon an elemental of unlimited power. There was no specific cap. You just wrote down, I'm summoning an elemental of power 36. You'd have to get you have to beat a target number of 36 to bind it once it got here, but still summon it. Now, of course, you would say, how can you get a success on that? Griffin, how would I get a success against a target number of 36 in Shadow?
Well, you need to roll a 5 or 6 to get a success on a single dice, so you would need about 3 times as many dice as the successes you're looking for. Or you re-roll them using your edge.
Well, or you re-roll your edge. Yes, except in first edition, you could just spend a karma point and get a free success at any roll every time.
Wonderful. So you just automatically get your big best new friend who has earth-shattering capabilities. Wonderful. I love it.
Pointedly, that was also a rule in Vampire, where you spent a willpower point and you got a free success. Notice in the new version of Vampire, it's roll 3 extra dice, not 1 free success. There's a reason for that. So that's the problem. Is rope is difficult because when you put a mechanic in front of a player that says, hey, this is really, really difficult to do and could possibly kill you, your players will look at that and say, how could I do this without it?
Yeah. How can I circumvent the consequences?
Right, which ideally should be what you want them to try engaging in, because, you know, we love seeing players suffer, but
there
needs to be a way for it to actually work out how you want it to.
I think in order for that to work, you have to explain to the players and say rationally, like, the reason why this exists is because this is a horror game. It would be like saying, we're going to play Call of Cthulhu, but we're going to remove the sanity cost from spells. You could play it, but if you did that, it would be fundamentally a different game than a Call of Cthulhu where you did have sanity. It's one of those things I think that doesn't come up that we're talking about here in Notes of the Aleph. They often tell people, you're a GM, you can make any changes you want, you know, play the game your way. But they're failing to explain this speaking of horror, you will make consequences will fall out from this. If you make changes to the way you're doing things, your players will notice and react accordingly. And so we can't blame players for reacting to rules.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, we got people in the chat here who are saying we should play Rollmaster. Maybe we should do a fundraiser drive for that because
Hey,
every now and then play Rollmaster to remind myself why I don't play Roll.
So speaking of Rollmaster and old school RPGs, quote unquote, I think there's maybe one thing we didn't hit on here, which was reading the book and then it kills you. Or in this case, burning the book so it doesn't kill you because your GM hates you and it's a horror game.
Oh, yeah.
Comments on that one?
That was a joke in Knights of the Dinner Table.
And previous to that as well, that was like Murphy's Rules. That's something. Do you remember I think it was the second or third edition of Call of Cthulhu actually had the a little bit of some cartoons in the back. That talked to, and one of them was like, you reading the book makes you die. I mean, but that's actually not a game mechanic. Reading books never makes you die. You just lose sanity. Whatever.
Right. There's two problems in Call of Cthulhu. One of them is that there's a lore skill in the game called Cthulhu Mythos. And it's supposed to be like all true knowledge of the Cthulhu Mythos is only in one skill. Everything you read in libraries is false. Only Cthulhu Mythos tells you what's true. And the Cthulhu Mythos skill, every time it goes up, it lowers your cap on sanity.
Yeah.
It's a percentile-based game. So you start with a cap of sanity of 99 minus your Cthulhu Mythos skill. So if your skill is 40%, then your max sanity is 59. So, and also your Cthulhu Mythos skill goes up whenever you meet a critter or, pointedly, a book. So if I read a book and it dropped my max sanity from 60 to 50 and my sanity was already higher than 60, well, I forget, if your max drops, does your sanity also drop, or was there a rule for that?
I believe it drops as well, yeah.
Yeah, it probably, whatever it is, you're slowly going crazy. And then what else is in the book? Spells. What do spells do? Spells cost sanity to cast them, which means you will also go crazy by reading the book. So, because anything you would learn from the book would also eventually kill you. So, right. And so that's where, but then you get into the problem where also Call of Cthulhu was an old school game. So you don't read a book in the middle of an adventure. You read a book between adventures.
They had like reading times listed, like weeks and weeks, I think.
Right. So, which means the book, this is not Buffy the Vampire Slayer. This is not Act 1, we encounter a monster. Act 2, we go to the library and find its weakness. Act 3, we go inflict the weakness on. That's not Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is you go meet the thing and you have and you're not leaving until this is done. It's not going to take weeks or months to solve this problem. I mean, maybe it's in the Mountains of Madness, but that's a campaign adventure, but that's several smaller set pieces. So books are not necessary to solve the adventure. They are something as an add-on. So that becomes a joke in the game because you don't need books to. This is the crux of one of the problems with horror role-playing. Mm-hmm. You don't need to know what the problem is to fix it. Because a good adventure will be written to say, like, we can just fail forward. We can just go ahead and solve the problem with whatever tools we have in hand. In which case, you don't need to know anything. You just show up, observe what's going on, make die rolls when they're asked of you, and either you get to the end or you don't. So that's
XP.
Yeah.
Sorry. But yeah, that's exactly, it's failing forward. It's the idea that, like, hey, you have everything, you are as equipped as you will ever be to deal with this situation, which means that if this situation was ever solvable, you are in a position to solve it, which means why take the risk of researching?
And I think there is like an easy scenario, or at least to go around that kind of idea or trope, which would be shutting down the nuclear reactor. So metaphorically, you would have something like the nuclear reactor for your little cultists to be trying to explode, but you still need to shut it down even if you go and beat up all the cultists. You might need to read a book to figure out how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in theory, but in practice...
In theory.
Right. I mean, players would complain about... Like one thing that we wanted to put in occult horror, because I'm a... was... one of the problems, I think, with horror adventures, like you know me, I'm not a big fan of top-down linearity failing forward. The idea that we could still confront the threat head on without having gathered more information or accomplished other tasks. We'll just be weaker at it. Like one of the things that came up during Red's Ironclaw game, the ghost. We met the Highwayman ghost, and what makes a ghost dangerous is it has higher stats if you don't know its name. And the ghost itself isn't that dangerous, but it hangs out with other. If it's hanging out with other undead, ghosts do a fear effect, and undead are stronger against those with fear. It's something we stole from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay again, guys. Gotta admit that. But so, in other words, we could just try to defeat this ghost by just showing up and hammering on it. But if we found out its name, this would be a lot easier. Because if we just called it by its name, that would remove a lot of its buffs and also like change its attack mode. Like when you piss it off, it just becomes enraged, which means it tries to attack you hand to hand, which is way less powerful than its other ability.
Yeah.
So if we just knew its name, but to know its name, we'd have to go out and search that. That makes it feel more like a horror adventure to me, because to be Act 1, it kicks your ass. Act 2, you do some research. Act 3, we come back and then try to defeat it conventionally. So that would feel more, like a horror game or research, and also where the book phase would work. I mean, Call of Cthulhu got that reputation for books being useless or books just killing you fatally because they were high risk and no reward. And I think that's dogged Call of Cthulhu even to the modern day. Because in Delta Green, you get a mission briefing where everyone tells you everything you need to know, and then you show up with guns and shoot it.
Someone already spent their 5 months doing the research.
Yeah.
Right. And since Call of Cthulhu isn't the best of combat systems, it makes me wonder, I'm guessing people enjoy combat. People play D&D First Edition. It just strikes me as a little odd, but people enjoy it. So who am I to tell people they're having bad wrong?
I mean, people like the SCP universe, which is basically the exact same concept as Delta Green. You go out with guns and you go capture monsters and you put them away forever.
Hmm.
And so I think part of that is the power fantasy of we do have complete control of these monsters, even if it's difficult.
Well, pointedly, Piat takes a different tack from this because Piat likes to set his adventures in very specific historical time periods that are somewhat obscure, like the Chautauqua movement of people showing up at carnivals and putting on all these displays and that kind of stuff. Like there were educational stuff, seminars. That's something that still goes on today and was very popular in the 20s and 30s. They weren't all as horribly racist, but it was the 20s and 30s, so then they were.
And
in fact, the 20s is a little late period for that because they were more popular. And the Greyfriars Club, the kids seminary, that's there's a whole crap ton of books from Britain about boys at boys' school and that sort of thing. And so he's invoking period pieces. And so part of what makes the game fun is you're invested in the period piece. And then it slowly falls apart into horror. And so it's a little more on the performative side where we're having fun experiencing that kind of thing. But notice, of course, that to solve those threats, those don't have a book phase. Like finding out, oh, wow, this thing that's supposed to cancel the Rite of Spring is going to cancel all life on Earth.
Right, you're more experiencing it, especially if you're a period character who is there in the moment as it's happening.
Yeah, you're kind of at a 10. We need to take it down to but that also gets into this little side thing. Also, I never found a word for this. Maybe megalomania, but it's the idea that what I'm doing is going to save the world. So whatever I do is okay. Because anything less than the destruction of the world is acceptable. Oh man, I hate to invoke real world brutality. It's okay for me to show up with
the means. Yeah.
A what?
Mm-hmm.
Just to ends justify the means.
Ends justify the means.
Yeah.
Like this is a scary real world analog. It's scary. I can show up at a pizza place with an automatic gun because I'm here to stop the secret pedophile net. And it doesn't matter what I do. Whatever I do will not be as bad as the secret pedophile.
I've had that kind of show up in adventures where, and again, it's one of my group of players in university. stalked a bunch of people who they thought were suspicious. They were torturing them in this sort of the cinematic, like beating them up in a chair kind of thing, sort of way, burning down their houses and getting into gun battles with them, and then realizing suddenly that these guys were just investigators like they were. And they both sides just look equally sketchy too, because they're like the guys stealing these books from the libraries and learning spells and skulking around, dark graveyards at night and stuff like this.
And some players might feel bad about that, but also this gets back to my big issue with Dungeons and Dragons, where all the monsters are clearly labeled evil. Every orc has the capacity for evil. And why I have issues with stuff like Delta Green, because it's just like, it's okay to be a secret shadow government organization armed with a bunch of guns that shows up to cultist houses and locks all the doors and shoots everyone inside. They're evil, and they want to destroy the world. So that's like the opposite of a horror adventure. That's complete moral justification. I mean, what they're doing is horrible, but I've been on those kinds of adventures with the players. They don't, it's Rainbow Six time. You don't feel bad about it. It's a game. No.
Yeah, it's Rainbow Six with the horror paint applied to it, essentially.
Yeah, you're shooting zombies instead of...
Yeah, and if people want to... Yeah, you're shooting zombies. It's basically what you said, it's shooting zombies. Kind of like,
shooting zombies instead of terrorists.
People were upset about Resident Evil 5 because they were asking the question, are these really zombies? It's like, it's okay, they have parasites. Trust us, they're just, even though they talk like people and act like people and fight like people, they're actually mind control.
So kind of a slight tangent here, but I think it's related to this, is so like orcs, goblins from Tolkien, and in showing in D&D, they're just essentially racially evil. Do you know when they started portraying these characters in literature as having always, invariably, almost, in British literature, having Cockney accents?
I know that shows up in Warhammer.
It goes way back to the 1850s, 1860s, sort of late industrial era. And so you'd have these like cozy, sort of like secret garden kind of stories. And when the evil fairies show up, and they're squalid, dirty Cockneys who are really good at machines. They know how to make gadgets and stuff. It is totally a class-based, this is the other, whatever we do them is okay because they're debased and they're evil and they were born twisted kind of thing.
And we really do just keep coming back to this note of imperialism and racism, don't we? Man,
and to this day,
this material.
To this day, you play an orc in a game, you've got a Cockney accent, probably.
Boy, if you start us, we'll make breakfast. Yeah, I think. Well, it's funny because we could do something about classism because you got the 20s and the 30s where the villains in Lovecraft are coded to be genetically inferior. Uneducated Southerners and also strange foreign others. Then you get to Vampire the Masquerade, where so you're a bunch of elites that live apart from everyone else that enjoy privilege and status and a shadow government that only applies to you. Whereas other people, what do they call people? That's right, cattle.
Cattle, yes.
So
wake up, sheeple.
Right. So there's social undertones that I know that they want to kind of keep out of Vampire, but you can't help but notice that it's like, well, what about the Nosferatu? Oh, are they terrible? It's like, yes, out of your 11 clans, one of them are bad people.
Well, they just look bad.
That's the one.
They're the ugly ones.
And they're just ugly. I mean,
they're just ugly. They're not the. I mean, I think there's something to be said in that fiction for this idea that like beauty is a marker of evil in many ways.
Right, that's always been a narrative trope for sure.
Yeah, but I think that there's probably social and class-based friction or fear at the heart of a lot of modern horror tales. I mean, I think I've held this belief for a long time. I don't know if it's something that other people think about or even holds water, but like the zombie fiction is huge these days, and zombie fiction is like prepper porn essentially.
I can't wait till I'm able to shoot my neighbors.
Right? Wouldn't it be great where in this future where all of the scientists and intellectuals create a virus that kills the whole world, but because I can fix an engine, I'm now the most important person in the city. Like, those are, it's interesting. So I think, yeah, that's just something, a lot of fear, a lot of horror-based stories have their roots in, yeah, societal frictions like that.
Yeah, and also like we're getting past the dividing line between horror and fantasy. And like as much as I love The Walking Dead, I've seen many of the edits where they make the Mario coin noise every time they do a headshot, so
Yeah.
they show you like, we got 20 headshots in a row. It's like, wow, you guys are good shots. But yeah, I mean, yeah, classism, and also as I'm fond of saying, this is a game, and people want to have fun. So I think one of the problems you're going into with horror is a lot of horror has those undertones of challenging that, whether it's unconscious, like we're not sure if it's conscious or unconscious in Lovecraft. Some of the vampire fiction is a lot more obvious. Society is an excellent 1980s movie that makes the class division obvious, whereas in Vampire, like I said, it's not entirely there. But did we come to the gaming table today for a lecture on classism, or did I come to the table today for everyone to validate my sexy power avatar?
Right.
I
mean, I think there's something to be said for a lot of people enjoy horror movies without ever getting past that surface level, not ever getting to the subtext. A lot of people love Cthulhu because the idea of driving a boat into the brain of a giant god is pretty fun. So, like, I think that there's definitely room for these. I wonder. Like, I'm not disagreeing with you, Raph, because I think that you make a very good point there. But just, I would maybe make an argument that in the same way that these stories have a lot of interesting content and subtext to them, I think you could make a thematically stronger story if you're basing it in some sort of actual, if you're giving it actual dramatic themes. But maybe I'm coming at it as a storyteller.
I like the way you're talking, but I would also mention, like, I'm closer to what my experiences with games like Vampire have been closer to Spoony, that people just want to grill, and they aren't here for the subtext of Vampire. They don't want to be, because we've already started making quotes. Like, this was in Requiem. I think they probably deleted from Masquerade, where they did all these quotes of saying, like, being a vampire has removed all emotional attachment to the sex act, but you still can physically enjoy it. So have lots of sex. And it's like, those are just like weird statements coming from a place of don't think, just enjoy.
Yeah.
The one thing I'm always commenting on, I don't know if this is still true in 5th edition, but in previous editions of Vampire, they would have little sidebars to say, okay, when you want to go harvest blood, take your best stat and your best skill, roll, and you get that many blood points back. Don't ask questions, and the keeper, the storyteller should never deny you this. You just run out and get blood points. Don't make a big deal. Don't talk about it. Blood's everywhere. And I'm always making a big deal about this. Like, that does not sound like a masquerade to me, or it doesn't sound to me like blood is a difficult to acquire resource when the rules are telling me you can go get this. Like, there's no chance of botching that. It's always consequence free.
Which seems to that seems to miss the point of most vampire stories or body horror story and all the rest. It's sort of like, yeah, that's.
I think it's a friction between what you're saying, Pirate, and Raph, which is it's a friction between what is going to be immediately fun for people when they pick up the book and look at the game versus what kind of stories the game can tell. And maybe I'm arguing on behalf of something that isn't there, but I think that the fact that you're rolling at all, and I can only speak to 5th edition, I think there's hooks there. Maybe I'm reading between the lines, but I feel like there's that's included because it's inviting you to turn those stories into drama. Maybe not every single time, but sometimes it gets messy, I
mean, I agree with you that the stuff is there, but also you look at the credits to the book and there's like a dozen people listed. Yeah. So while some people might play the game that way, other people might, and I'm always trying to go back to, yes, someone might invoke those themes, but these books are, sell thousands, if not millions of copies. how are most people playing? It's kind of like saying, like, yeah, we could have a very thoughtful and methodical raiding party, or we could have a Call of Duty game where we discuss all the issues that are going on, but that's not the way 98% of people are doing it.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess let's go ahead and do one last little wrap up, one little round circle. So, any last words we want to get in on the subject of horror, Cthulhu, and these RPGs? Yeah, what do you got to say?
I'm going to say that it's very difficult to capture what the essence of a Lovecraftian story is in an RPG, because a lot of it is about a very conservative fear of change, loss of self, and conquest of the other. And a lot of that is unfortunately deeply rooted in Lovecraft's own racism, which was, I will say, notable even for its time, despite what people say, oh, he's a product of his times. But it's like, yeah, all his friends were like, dude, your wife's Jewish, like, kind of tone it down, man, like, sort of thing. But it is possible to capture that, I think. You just have to be, I don't know, more methodical, more thoughtful about where you're presenting the game and how you're writing it. But at the same time, I don't think people should necessarily be afraid of just wanting to have fun where you go around and shoot ghouls and
Right. Red, what have you got to say?
I like what Pyatt just said. I think if I was going to give any advice to storytellers out there who are running games that they want to introduce horror into, I think the fastest way is to figure out what it is your players care about and work backwards from there. But I also think I still hold to this idea that there is thematic power if you dig a little bit deeper past the surface level of your cool zombie killing action game. You can figure out what is actually making these stories interesting and stressful and scary. So I'd recommend thinking about that as well.
All right. And Rafferty, what are your final notes for today?
Well, I'm always a fan of talking to your players and finding out what they want to do, because I think the thing I think that's most vexing about games is you will have some people who came to the table who want something that's going to be thrilling and meticulous, and like I agree, often these games will have notes that are there, but they'll also have other things of you're cool and hot and awesome, or here's, you can buy your gun skill up really high because, like, you're not supposed to, but the book says you can have guns 90 and stuff. So because these role-playing game books often, like, not all of them, but some of them have different paths in them, you'll get people at the table who have very different ideas about what to do. And a common problem in gaming is that the easy, fun-loving combat person will start to dominate the game. So I think basically the summary of all of this is there's a lot of good tools out there for horror, and I think if you invest in what we talked about of making it personal, putting things of folks at risk, their possessions, their loved ones, their world, and focus on making stakes, you can still make any game fun as long as there's good stakes in it. But I think we need to recognize that being in a large role-playing game group with there's 4 to 6 of you, so it's hard to intimidate. Some themes I think are just not going to work, like existential horror and that sort of thing isn't going to work as well, I think, as the immediate horror of loss, stakes, and losing. It's a game, and people are going to think of it in terms of win-lose or advantage-disadvantage. You might be able to get existential stuff, but I think we need to focus a lot more on immediacy and improv to make a horror game have that kind of level.
All right. And I guess my concluding note would be that, of course, anytime you go in with a theme, just kind of check and see, do things support the theme that you're after? Is this the theme that your group wants to go for? And of course, kind of try to understand what the metaphor is behind the things that are actually happening, if that's kind of really what you're aiming for. So, for now, that's going to be all for today. For our notes from the Aleph, we stream episodes bi-weekly, Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can join us live on Twitch at twitch.tv/Ractus. We also stream and record weekly tabletop games at the same channel, and you can come join us when we start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Sundays and Wednesdays. Norman Rafferty here is a partner and writer for Sanguine Games. Check out sanguinegames.com and join on the Reddit and Twitter, and look forward to the upcoming Book of Corals, Ironclaw Adventure, or you can have your own pirate adventure. Don't forget to check out RedRabbit and book him for a game over on startplayinggames.com as Oracular Pig. And yeah, do you have a shout out you want to do?
Hi, I'm awesome.
All right, good,
Go buy Raph's books
Yeah,
because I wrote some of them.
good endorsement. In that case, go ahead, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and come see us all again. Till next time.
Bye.
You got